thank you so much. Very much appreciate all of you joining us today. I'm Pamela Roussos, Chief Community Officer at Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And so scaling technology-enabled sustainable food systems in Africa is an imperative for half of its citizens facing food insecurity, and to 60% of the population who earn their living as smallholder farmers. While there's been progress made, a recent McKinsey report states that Africa could be 2 to 3 times more productive if it intensified its agricultural production. And there was a call to action for governments, investors, development partners to do more. And at Miller Center, we've seen social enterprises address various parts of the value chain, from strengthening farmers' ability to grow high quality crops by providing data and information, connecting crops to markets, extending the life of produce, and reducing post-harvest loss. And that's not enough. It takes a village. Many stakeholders need to come together in order to address the many systemic challenges that exist. Social entrepreneurs, impact investors, government officials, the private sector, and other technical assistance and development partners. And we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, as one of our panelists, Lloyd LePage, calls it, the elephant in the room, the global pandemic. It has shown a spotlight on an already brittle and crumbling, in some cases, sustainable food systems. As we look to the future to address these systemic challenges, as we build back better, we must build a system that is resilient and responsive. How do we do that across the social, environmental, and economic systems that comprise this ecosystem? And how do we bring all the stakeholders to the table to do so? So that's the discussion that our panelists, together with you, will be having over the next 90 minutes or so. So I'd like to ask all of you to share what you think are the greatest challenges to building a sustainable food systems in Africa. So again, Daniel is going to launch this poll. And as he's doing that, I'm going to share my screen so you get a sense of who's our panelists are going to be. So if you guys can go ahead and respond to that poll, that would be fantastic. So here, let me share the results. So as you can see, access to finance is the highest, followed by technology, trade regulations, gender and social norms, and policy. So that gives us a sense of where you'll be coming into this discussion. So I don't know about you, but the last conference that I was at physically and the last international trip that I made was to Sandkalp last year. So by now, I think most of us kind of are familiar with this virtual conferencing world. But I would like to encourage all of you to be a part of this conversation. And so if you have any questions that you've typed those into the chat, we will work with the panel and ask questions. I've got questions for them, but then we will also move to your questions as well. So I don't want to spend our time kind of reading the bios of our panelists. They're amazing people, and you can go and check them out on the conferencing app. And I don't want to spend time for them to explain who they are. So the way that we're going to get into this discussion is stop sharing. The way that we're going to get into this discussion is for me to ask a big question, if you will, and then it'll give you a sense of who the panelists are, where they're coming from, and their experience. So the big question is, in your opinion, what do you feel needs to be done to scale technology-enabled food systems value chains on the continent? And so, Brenda, why don't we get started with you? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. To answer your question, I'd like to start off with just highlighting maybe the 5 main aspects that I believe do really provide a hurdle in terms of scaling technology for food-enabled food systems in our value chains. And I think the rest of the panelists will also be able to really divulge more into the different issues. So one would be really digitalization. So looking at how do we really increase the reach of communication systems or looking at mobile network coverage to adapt really the available user interfaces that are there, and really maybe adopting a blended approach with the use of traditional technology and also the improved technology. So for example, the use of interactive voice responses, SMSing systems, community radio, really, and maybe youth-led digital extension services, because we do have technology that is there that can be scaled, but is there actual reach or communication systems that are available to assist in scaling and scaling this in a more sustainable manner? Second would really be integrating the aspect of prioritizing data-driven systems, because a lot of our systems are lacking in terms of data, looking at our food systems, food safety, post-harvest loss, climate change initiatives, regenerative agriculture approaches. These are technologies that are rarely data-driven, especially looking at our continent of Africa. And really we need data to inform or really to tailor, not really a one-size-fits-all solution, but something that is really tailored to the issues that are facing our specific systems. Thirdly, would be looking at the technologies that we have available. Are they economically, socially, or environmentally friendly, I would say? Economically, let's look at it in terms of, are they creating jobs or income for those who are to adopt these different technologies? Socially, are they actually inclusive to really address marginalized communities? Are they co-created with these different communities to really identify the issues that they're being faced and how scalable they are within the communities? And again, environmental aspects. Are these technologies really safeguarding natural resources or, like low GHG emissions, soil, water quality? Really, are we looking at the different facets of technology within our food systems to allow them to scale within those three different areas? Fourth would be maybe to look at the aspect of co-creation, because we should apply more of a problem-solving approach when looking at identifying issues within our value chains in the food systems and identifying or designing technologies that are suitable to the context, rather than vice versa, where identifying the technology before identifying what the actual problem is and what is being addressed within these different value chains to really scale and ensure this, scalability and sustainability. And final, integrate gender and youth, really applying that gender lens when we're looking at the different technologies that we're applying. I would like to say maybe like, and how do we de-gender technology? When we're creating technology that is supposed to be friendly for the youth, for women, how is this technology designed to actually fit into the social cultural norms that really do affect those we are trying to solve these different hurdles for? So really identifying these technologies, and I saw that finance is one of the biggest factors that has been identified as something that really is a hurdle in terms of scaling technologies. And indeed, how do we even de-gender financing technologies and institutions to really incorporate gender and youth? So yeah, that's from me, Pamela.
Great, thanks, Brenda. That was terrific. So Bill, maybe we can move over to you and hear what your thoughts are.
Thank you very much, Pamela. I think really the role of the public sector is very critical, especially within the African context. If you take the example of Rwanda, where the large part of our population is within the agriculture sector, and most of them are smallholder farmers. So farming on average about 0.1 of a hectare. So the economies of scale are extremely low. Some are still transitioning from subsistence farming to commercial farming. So issues of scaling up technology would really need the role of the public sector to play an enabler role, where you need farmer organizations to be able to put farmers together so that they can be able to achieve economies of scale in terms of purchase of inputs, agronomic services from extension workers, because each one of them as an individual most probably would not be able to farm competitively or even afford some of these technologies. But as a group, through land consolidation, through cooperatives, they can be able to farm more competitively. They can be able to put together produce together, and they can even be able to market their produce as a large group. So the role of government is very important to ensure that smallholder farmers can be able to farm competitively. But also equally being able to ensure that certain shared services can be available to smallholder farmers, where some of these technologies can be shared among smallholder farmers over time. At the same time, be able to avail some of these facilities that can be available at subsidized rates. So because some of these technologies are beyond the reach of smallholder farmers. At the same time, being able to provide certain advisory services through information that has been collected over time to be able to ascertain demand and supply and be able to determine what commodities can be produced in what quantities, in what areas, who would be able to buy and at what price they would be able to buy. So the role of the public sector in the beginning, in the formative stage, is very critical to bring different stakeholders in place and ensuring that they can be able to undertake some of these activities in a profitable way. So the planning of food value chains requires a number of stakeholders. One, because to be able to do it in an organized manner, to avoid post-harvest losses, to avoid food wastage, because there's also that component that some of the produce is perishable, so it is produced in large quantities and the market cannot be able to absorb it. Most probably, it will end up being wasted. So I would think that the enabling role of the public sector is very important. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Angela, please join the conversation.
Thank you, Pamela. What I'd just like to say is one of the greatest challenges we have with the issue of scaling up technology would be affordability and accessibility. Because you may, I mean, if you don't know it's there, you're not going to be able to use it. So you need to be made aware that it's there, and it needs to be something that you can afford. I know financing is a big problem for the small scale farmers. So like the farmers we work with, I mean, a lot of them struggle with financing and they're always looking for handouts. But one thing I believe in is if you first link them with funders and then they have to pay back the money, there's some accountability that comes with it. So they have access to that finance and you follow through with them and make sure they're doing the right thing. And then they're accountable. They have to, you know, pay back that money. That way, that sustainability element can be created. And I also believe this is doable if you have public-private partnerships, because the government does a lot and, you know, has very good intentions, but a lot of times government resources get wasted. So when you put in the private element, actually all investors are looking to make profit. So the only way to sustain these efforts is to make sure that there's an end game that is beneficial to everybody. And I think profit is a very good motivator. So when you have these public-private partnerships, then definitely you're going to have sustainability. And then scalability can come in because then you can access finance because you have good records. And then, you know, you're applying technology, your environment, you know, you're applying technology that is affordable and it's, you know, it's been, it's technology that's new, you know, and you're able to get access to research and that kind of thing. And then again, when you go into the public sector, you have cooperatives. So these small scale farmers can come together in groups. And when they're in groups, they have a better bargaining power. They have access to, you know, more resources. So I think with all the things that my colleagues have said, then coupled with the issue of working together, and then capacity building, and then public-private partnership will go a long way in making sure that this is sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lloyd?
Thanks, Pamela, for what's on the surface is a very simple question, but opens the door for a very complex answer and challenge. And I'd maybe at this point just like to give a note of thanks to Sankalp and especially the Miller Center, Pamela, for hosting this event today. Today we face really also the ongoing impacts of COVID, but also the challenges of climate change impacts and the ever increasing and consuming populations with the impacts of their environmental footprint, the sustainability and the responsiveness of what they are consuming, and their ability to adapt to more diverse demands from the cities, for example. I like the terminology that's used in the title of the session in terms of racing to scale, and I do believe that when we look at the population demands that is projected in even up to 2030, 2050, it really is a matter of racing for scale. And Africa remains one of the largest opportunities to be able to fill the gaps that is needed in not only the African food systems, but global food systems. And we need to be starting to think beyond Africa as a consumer to Africa as a producer, and really expanding and feeding the world, not the world feeding Africa. So just like to make those points. Quickly to your question. First, I believe that, like Bill, to achieve national and regional and continental scale really requires enlightened leadership and strategy at the very heart of government, and the heads of multilateral institutions and private sector that can support them and can join with them in that partnership to create a sustainable growth in the sector. These leaders truly believe that agriculture and its related food systems are the engine for growth and a platform for which manufacturing and services can be built. It's not just about the liability of food security, but also the opportunity to create real and economic growth through agriculture-based economy. Such leadership would set about building the infrastructure and enabling environments to allow the scale even to the last mile. When we talk about financing, when we talk about energy infrastructure, when we talk about road infrastructure, that needs to reach to the last mile. And when we talk about scaling, we really should be talking about national scale. So how do we get enlightened leaders that can create the sense of urgency around national scale development in the agriculture sector? Fortunately, in Africa, that is starting to emerge. And many of the governments that we're working with, TBI, Tony Blair Institute, works with over 15 governments, where we stand side by side with them to support and advise on the national priorities, including on the agriculture and food systems. But it's also important that the governments not only think about agriculture and food systems growth through their ministries of agriculture, but also through education, through health, through transport, commerce, investment, and trade, all of which are necessary to effectively scale up food systems. And then importantly, farm and village level support systems. These are sections that can be supported by government and the development partners, but also farmers helping themselves. As we've seen in Southeast Asia, farmers have created their own groups at a village level and really sort of scaling up the technologies that are coming into those is something that the governments can really help to do. This is really important about building a digital backbone that over time can be added to and built to become future-proof. It's important that that data system is there to be able to allow policymakers to build, to make good decisions based on the information that they have at their hands. The second really, and I'll stop here, is I think it's key that governments and leaders need that data at the very basic, right away from the farm level, right through to the whole value chain, and to be able to make near live decisions so that data is coming in. It's possible now to use information systems to be able to track things like markets, weather, finance, crop production, trade, farmers, land use, and disease. And these are all important to be able to not only make wise decisions in terms of policy, but also wise decisions in terms of investment, wise decisions in terms of market access. And that will in turn enable smallholder farmers, SMEs that support them, and also businesses to be able to have much more sustainable business. And I'll stop there at that point. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you all. So, I mean, so we've heard that in order to scale these, the value chains for sustainable food systems, technology plays a key role. The fact that gender needs to be a part of the discussion, integral into this discussion, the role of government, and as Angela said, that it is going to take a village. Public-private partnerships, it's not just one group of actors that can go and make the changes that are needed. So, you know, when I was preparing for this discussion, I was thinking about, well, what does resilience mean? And so, of course, I kind of have my own definition of what resilience means, but I wanted to go see what the experts had to say. And some of the experts were saying that resilience means that it's systems that are equal, that they're highly interconnected, that there's high levels of information so that adaptation and change can happen quickly as needed. And we're just hearing that that is needed in terms of market information, and that that asymmetry, which is basically what the reality of the system is today, of these market systems, is that it's asymmetric. In order for us to build symmetry and to build a strong base in order to grow from, information and is key to that in the definition of what resilience means. And so we've been talking about, you know, the need to get information from farmers, and all the information, as Lloyd was saying, all the information and data, as Brenda was also saying too, is that this digitalization is imperative. So I'm wondering if we can talk about some tools and innovations, maybe some processes or policies that we can put in place to balance this market information in the system to build sustainability and scalability into these value chains. And so maybe, let's see, George, maybe we can start with you. I'm sorry, Bill.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine, Pamela. It is fine. I'll give maybe an example of the tea sector in Rwanda, but it has benefited for maybe 6 decades of continuous growth and learning. But you find that based on the nature of the commodity, you can be able, within a certain degree, to tell the cost of producing a kilogram of tea by a farmer. You can be able to tell the yields that they can be able to achieve in a given year, depending on the climate and everything. And also you can be able to determine what is happening within the market for at least a period of 1 year within a certain margin of error. And over time, farmers have been able to understand also the different market forces that would affect their price of a kilo of green leaf that they will supply to the factory. And because of the different stakeholders within that value chain, if anything goes wrong within the value chain, then you can be able to, within a certain degree, be able to know where you have failed and how you can be able to address that concern. And the farmers, to some extent, they know their rights and know that if they have grown good quality tea, they have supplied good leaf, if the factory processes are good, they should be able to deliver a good cup of tea to the market, and they should be rewarded equally in return. So over the years, the example in Rwanda is that the farmers have continuously grown their share into the price of tea, to the extent where today they get about 50% of the price of tea at the auction. Now, the same cannot be said for some of the other value chains, given their different complexities. But with determination, I think that is still, one is still able to achieve that with value chain organization, with deliberate systems in place to ensure that those different actors within a value chain understand that working together, sharing information, and understanding that they are all bound to benefit if they look at what you mentioned, resilience. Resilience within a value chain to a large extent is beyond other factors that may be beyond control, is for the actors within that value chain to continuously think how they can be able to ensure that there is equity and sustainability within that value chain. That way they can be able to, as a group, understand whether there are challenges at the production level, at the processing level, at the aggregation level, within the logistics, and even the market. We've seen where certain value chains have had to differentiate their product in the end market to be able to attract new consumers, because they need to reinvent themselves over and over again with the different needs today of growing retail, e-commerce. So they reinvent themselves over time to meet changing market demands. I don't know if that is helpful at all.
Yes, that's helpful. I mean, it sounds like, you know, in Rwanda, the tea farmers have a market information. It seems like, you know, I was talking about earlier, there's asymmetry in the system, and it sounds like in Rwanda with the tea farmers, not necessarily with other farmers, there is more symmetry in the system because of this systems that you're talking about in terms of being able to track information from the farmer to market. And and I think that that's kind of what we need to see, is more of that across some of the value chains. And so Angela, maybe you can share a little bit about, because I mean, you're doing a lot of this with Rio Fish and trying to provide some equity in the value chain, in particular for women fisher people.
Thank you, Pamela. I mean, one thing that I've always known is that an efficient market is where information flows freely and is readily available to everyone. So that way there's equity, and it's all down to your choices. Now, if you have the information, you understand your market, you can respond to the changes, and definitely that'll help you to survive. One of the challenges that the women in the fish value chain face is that a lot of them just understand, for example, take a trader. I understand this is how I get my fish, this is where I get it, and this is how I sell it. But the thing is, if you know how your fish is grown, for example, if you're getting your fish from a farmer, where they source their inputs, and then what kind of practices do they engage in as they grow their fish, and then you know who your customers are, what exactly your customer wants, you're better able to serve them. So I believe that if you connect all these fish value chain stakeholders, then you have an efficient market, because everybody knows where to get what at the best price, you know, and the best quality. That way, then you have the best prices for the farmers, and then the consumers also enjoy good prices, and they also get good quality, and they actually get the variety of what they're looking for. So I just believe that that connection, and if you have, for example, the fish value chain for the longest time has had this problem whereby farmers cannot access the market. So we know that in Kenya that there is a serious shortfall of supply of fish. But the problem is, as a farmer, you grow your fish, and then after your fish is ready, realize you don't even know where to sell that fish. And so many farmers are losing value because you grow your fish, it's ready, and then nobody's buying your fish. Then the unfortunate thing is, again, how do you get your fish to, you don't know the market. And even if you know the market, how do you get your fish to that market? So I believe if all these fish value chain stakeholders are linked, then there's efficiency in that market because that information is flowing freely and everybody knows where to get what. And that way you derive value from everybody in that market chain. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. And so building on that point, Brenda, you brought up prioritizing data-driven systems as one of the things that you think is needed. And so can you talk a little bit more about, are you seeing that happen? Are there some innovations you're seeing or some places where you're seeing that happen that you think could be replicated? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Pamela. Maybe just to add on to what Bill and Dero have said, it's much of you're only as resilient as the amount of information that you have, really, to support. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I think you're only as resilient as the information that you really have within your system. So to answer your question in terms of, do we have data-driven systems within our different contexts? Maybe to give an example is, for example, in Kenya, when we look at maybe extension services. So how do we offer proper extension services that would also piggyback on traceability aspects for improved farm produce? We have systems like the eProd traceability system that really creates or aggregates data from all the farmers that they work with, farmer cooperatives, farmer associations, and really create that aspect of collecting data from production all the way to the consumer aspect. So really using that kind of data where you can ensure you understand how much acreage is under plantation for, let's say, green beans, how many farmers are working in a different location, what are the needs of the customers, and how can we trace the use of inputs across that particular value chain. So using systems such as the eProd system, that is also as well a technology that provides that scalability for within the agricultural sector for the food systems, is a really good example of technologies that are providing that, what we'd say, market information to really provide data on how we can really scale and also reform our systems. And another aspect that I'd like to talk about is, how do we normalize discussions around climate smart agriculture, post-harvest loss management with farmers themselves? Because I think these are some of the tools or processes that we need to normalize to provide information to our farmers. That would be the return, or rather the improvement of the provision of extension services to farmers, more talking about or really embedding that adaptability of climate-smart agriculture into local food systems, because we need to move away from the conference room discussions to the farm level. Are they aware of the kind of seed systems that they need to adapt to really become resilient in the changing times, with climate aspects, and also, as Lloyd had mentioned, really looking at aspects of COVID-19. How resilient are our farmers? What kind of information are they getting from our different systems? And really designing systems and policies that aim to really dispatch information to farmers that are really contextualized. Another good example is the use of a technology called the Amplio book, which is within East Africa, being used in Kenya and Rwanda. Really, it's portable, let's say like a radio that has pre-recorded messages on good agricultural practices that can be sent out to different communities in their local language, really passing on that information to the farmers. So really designing systems and policies that create an environment that allows that adaptability and information to really flow to the different farmers. Yeah, back to you, Pamela.
Thanks, Brenda. That was really helpful in terms of one of the questions that was asked by the audience was like, can you share examples of promising developments of digitalization? And so eProd, which is not a system I had heard of, and then Amplio, actually, I have. They went through our accelerator program several years ago. So, and there are others too. We've worked with a number of social enterprises that are working on different pieces of the value chain in terms of providing information to farmers, connecting crops to markets, making sure that farmers have the prices, as Bill was saying, making sure that they understand what they should be getting for their crops and such like that. So there are various efforts that are happening. One question is, how do we start to bring all these things together in order to, because I was just thinking, Brenda, you were talking about eProd, and then Angela saying, there's a lack of that kind of that digitization, it sounds like, in the fish value chain. And so how do we bring these different efforts together in order to support many different value chains across this? And the other thing that I heard you say, Brenda, ties back into what you mentioned at the beginning, is just really understanding the problem first, and really making sure that you're taking a problem-solving approach rather than just showcasing a solution just because you think it's cool, so to speak. Okay, so I'd like to move on in terms of, one of the thoughts that people were saying is that financing is an issue. And certainly, again, when you think of asymmetries in the system, information, we were just talking about that. Economic asymmetry is another, economics is another asymmetry in the system. And I can't remember who it was. I think it was Angela was mentioning about, just farmers not being able to, have money to pay for inputs and the machinery and such like that they need in order to grow high quality crops. And then I know that many of the social enterprises that we support struggle with and are doing amazing work in these value chains, are struggling to find funding. And so what can be done to move capital into the various parts of the value chain in order, again, so things are flowing smoothly through these systems? And so Lloyd, maybe you can kick us off with that question.
Thanks. Can you hear me all right? I had to switch to
Yes.
earphones.
Yep.
Yeah. I think it's a really important question, because there's, every time, and even on the survey this morning or just now, we've seen that finance is always referred to as the biggest challenge. But actually, it's always a question of, well, okay, so what would you do with that money when you had it? If you have that available. And so really coming back to this sort of market-led approach and really understanding the dynamics of what makes an investable business, what is it? And part of the things that we've talked about just now, that sort of value chain approach, where we identify, some of the areas that, for example, data is really important as a public good, but there's other parts that can be tapped in as, as for a proprietary opportunity for businesses to tap into. And I'll give you an example of that, where, for example, in a particular value chain, you might have at any one time excess of a particular product at a certain season. At the end of the season, the harvest season, you have excess at that time. If you have, other opportunities in technologies to do greenhouse production or something, you can change the dynamics of what that looks like if you have the access to the information to say, hey, in August is not, that's when everything is harvested. Why don't you harvest something in earlier on in the year? But to make, to come back to your question, access to finance really relates to key things such as, first of all, a decent business plan, an ability to be able to not only, it's finding, companies that have the ability to receive that money, to receive the money that they have, to have a decent business plan. And also there's a challenge that you have, hundreds of small businesses that require investment, but it takes as long to do an assessment on one, $500,000 company as it does to do an assessment, a due diligence assessment on a $10 million investment. So there's this sort of opportunity cost of that time, of doing your due diligence, doing your market assessment, doing your assessment of the company, and solving that problem. I think digital tools can really help to unlock that gap or that challenge in terms of being able to rapidly assess hundreds, millions, if you like, of small companies to be able to release the cash to them, or release that. But it needs to be connected, as I said, to market-led solutions, and also value chain solutions. Thanks.
Thanks, Lloyd. Angela, I know that you as a social entrepreneur are looking for funding and such. And what are some of the challenges that you have experienced yourself on getting the funding that you need in order to do the amazing work that you're doing, working with women in the fish value chain?
Thank you, Pamela. That's, one of those questions that everybody would ask me. Okay, the thing is, getting funding, especially for social enterprise, is a very big problem, because most people view social enterprises as just grant-seeking organizations. And with us, we do it differently, because one of our focus points is sustainability. So I don't want to help maybe a group of women raise money, and then tomorrow they come back to me again, it's not sustainable. So one of the challenges that people don't want to fund such organizations because they look at it like as a black hole. So it's usually mainly just impact investors who'd be interested in that. But I'm coming in and saying that I'm looking at a profitable enterprise, because I want to be able to come tomorrow and tell you, look, you gave me this money and we put it in here and grew this much. So I'm trying to help people around me move away from this element of, give us this, give us that. No, I'm saying we can lend you this, and then you need to demonstrate to me that you're going to grow it and, pay back and be able to continue. So the greatest challenge we face is that no one wants to fund social enterprise because we're not seen to be profitable. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you. And to bring a couple of these conversations together too, so we're talking about digitization, I can't say that quickly, and the role of technology in this, and then access to finance. And like I said, we've seen a lot of smallholder farmers. They don't have the capital they need in order to buy inputs and then to access the machinery and such that they need. I'm wondering if any of you are starting to see solutions around, certainly mobile money in order to address this challenge for smallholder farmers and getting the access to the capital that they need in order at that moment to do their work, so that they can repay once their crops have gone to market. Any solutions that you've seen that are kind of working towards this? And maybe Brenda can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Pamela. So I think finance is always a very big topic of discussion. And one of the main solutions I've actually seen is having a systems approach financing model, really. And I'll give an example. For example, in Kenya, an organization called Amiran really has designed what we call value chain financing by identifying areas within the value chain that require financing and offering loans with very flexible repayment systems for youth cooperatives or farmer cooperatives. For example, one organization that I've personally worked with called Meru Greens in Kenya identified that they required cold storage technologies within their value chain, really to reduce post-harvest losses and increase their crop value. So what did they do? They got a loan from the bank, identifying the specific area within the value chain that they needed to be addressed, and acquired their cold storage. And in terms, with what Angela was saying, really looking at, is it scalable? Is it profitable? Indeed, by reducing post-harvest losses, you have more produce to really sell and increase your crop value. So really identifying and adapting different financial systems that address specific issues within the value chain and really looking at it, as I said, holistically as a system and not really just modular aspects of the value chain, or looking at microfinance institutions that really offer specific financial packages that are tailored to really small scale farmers. Because if you look at the bigger financial institutions or the big banks, small scale farmers are not really attractive when it comes to your return on investment. So we really just have to look at how do we adapt and not really try and fit small scale farmer institutions into a larger financial systems. Let's see how we can really adapt the institutions. And maybe another example, which is really close to heart, is within the dairy sector, where I've also worked, the formation of farmer cooperatives is very key. Cooperatives and associations really to provide farmers with that purchasing power or that access to finance. A good example is a cooperative called the Githunguri Dairy Farmers Cooperative, who were able to really provide infrastructure for dairy farmers to really aggregate and sell their dairy produce by providing cold chain storage, transport, and that particular market. And within that cooperative, farmers are able to find, access financial support under the umbrella of using farmer cooperatives. So those would be my examples, and really looking at it holistically as a system and not really the modular aspect of financing. Yeah, back to you, Pamela.
Great, thanks, Brenda. And it looks like Bill, you wanted to join in the conversation.
Yeah, maybe I'll share two examples of what is happening. For example, still going to the smallholder farms, where you find that being able to mobilize the public sector to de-risk certain sectors, patient capital that is willing to forego return in the short run, being able to bring in certain development partners that have certain skills or have certain reach that would be almost impossible for a private sector company to do on their own, but also to have an off-taker of the product that is willing to be part of that consortium of different actors that are willing to play an individual role for a larger good within that whole ecosystem of value chain. We've seen that really reduce the number of risks that otherwise would have made it almost impossible for a financing institution on their own to be able to finance that particular value chain. And there are quite a number of things that have with certain funds that can be able to help, for example, cover first loss. Most of the farmers lose everything in their first season. So for them to be able to take over that particular value chain, they will have to amass savings over a period of time for them to even think about going back to farming. So, but where you can be able to get people to fund first loss, then they can be able to go back to that particular activity, knowing that there is still a chance to be able to succeed. Insurance, crop insurance, livestock insurance, bankers find that very helpful, knowing that there's a fallback position in case something that was not anticipated happens. Finally, we're seeing some banks that have started credit scoring some of their farmers. And given their credit rating, that they can be able to advance micro loans to some of these farmers without necessarily seeking to take their title deeds, because usually some of the amounts they want to borrow for a period of 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, and be able to repay back at the end of the season. So There is a lot that we can see. I don't know if it is because of what is happening in the other sectors, but there is a lot of interest within the financial institutions, their book value in the agriculture sector, where at the moment it's really, really, really low. Almost 2 to 3% of their loan portfolios. But we're seeing some ambition of some financial institutions trying to grow their loan portfolio into the ag sector. But it can only be possible, and it will only be possible to for those financing institutions that can bring like-minded institutions to share the risk. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, so it's great to hear that there, as Lloyd said at the beginning about having enlightened government leaders. It's great to see that and hear that there's some enlightened banking leaders in the banking industry as well, and understanding that there's this whole huge market opportunity in these smallholder farmers. And again, trying to think about what is the right solution, what's the problem that they're facing, and co-creating solutions that can support them. So that's great. Lloyd, you wanted to?
Yeah, just wanted to add a very quick one. In Kenya, Safaricom, which is a phone provider, actually has created DigiFarm. DigiFarm is an integrated mobile platform that offers farmers convenient one-stop access to a suite of products, including financial and credit services, quality farm products, and customized information on farming best practice. And if you look at some of their results, they've gone from starting off at about 20,000 farmers, and now over 1 million farmers are utilizing the system at the last report. So these are the kinds of tools that bring together phone companies, banks, input providers, and farmers, and can be used very effectively. There's others in West Africa, and I can think of a few like Manobi Corporation and others that are also engaged in this level. In Rwanda and others, we have also started exploring relationships with both Crop-In and also with AgriTask. Both of those also are utilizing digital systems as a platform for creating monetary value also. Great,
thanks, Lloyd. And also to go back to Bill's point too about blended capital and having that patient first loss capital in a capital stack. I mean, we're seeing a lot more of that Miller Center working with social enterprises globally, that's more and more the way that that funding can go. So to basically take risk off the table for some of the investors to basically kind of crowd in more funding and financing into all of these value chains. So that's great. Another asymmetry that I wanted to touch on, but and it's been brought up already, and I think it's an important, very important one, is the social asymmetry and the fact that women are the majority of farmers on the continent, and yet, in many cases they don't own their own land. There's a higher level of illiteracy because girls are pulled out of school so that they can work in the fields and they can fetch water and get firewood for cooking and such. And so, Brenda, you brought it up at the very beginning, really integrating gender and youth into this is really important. And so just wondering, maybe Brenda, you can kick us off in terms of what you've seen and where you still see some big missing pieces in integrating gender. So again, to create a balance in the system around social inclusion.
Yeah, thank you, Pamela. So I think the biggest gap that we still have is really the behavioral change aspect, because when you look at the social aspect of really introducing technology and scaling technology in food systems, we're looking at how is technology perceived in the social cultural norms, because when you come to a community, they have ways in which they produce their different produce in their community. So looking at how do we prioritize behavioral change campaigns within the different communities, because without that change, really you will not have women in leadership, accessing the different solutions or technologies that are being introduced at the community level. And I'd also mention the aspect of really what I like saying is degendering technology, really, because gender is very complex. It's a huge barrier that we have to work with and around. And really, when designing technologies that are going to the different communities, touching on agriculture, really identifying what are the social cultural norms that are preventing technology from really kicking off at the community level, because you might find that a female farmer in Zambia will be able to access her smartphone, but maybe a female farmer in rural Tanzania might be, her phone is a community phone, so she's not able to actually access the technologies or applications that are being designed that are specifically targeting women within the community. So really understanding what behaviors need to change, how do the technologies have to be adapted to address these different issues, and really bringing in female leadership on the table. And that means providing a safe space for both men and women to discuss, because when you're looking at gender and social norms, really there are roles within the gender communities that have to be looked at when you're trying to really break that down. And lastly, policy, because you had mentioned access to land, access to finance. Really, that is also embedded in creating inclusive policies that really touch on land tenure issues. For example, in Kenya, the National Land Policy provides legal support for women to own land, and that really has provided an aspect for women to go into agriculture themselves without needing permission from their husbands or the men in their families. And also bringing in these different community elders, because most of the time they're the ones who determine land ownership, overall community decisions. So how do we bring community elders into that space within a policy environment that is enabling? So first of all, behavioral change would be the number one. Back to you, Pamela. Yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. Angela, you work a lot with women and making sure that they have a seat at the table. As Brenda was talking about, maybe you can share some of the, and as Brenda was also saying, behavior change is that's imperative, and you have been successful in doing that. So what, if you could share a few key points of your success in being able to do that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. I mean, behavior change is very, very critical. I've realized, like, in the fish value chain, along Lake Victoria, it's the men who fish. There's no questions about that. Men fish, women sell the fish. And there's these taboos around, if women go into the boat will sink, or the community will perish. And that's been going on for ages. But what I realized is, like, Brenda spoke about a safe space where all these things can be discussed both by men and women. And when you sit and talk about these things openly and freely, you realize that the men, actually, in the beginning, they're very apprehensive and they don't want to talk. But once you demonstrate to them that, nothing is going to happen, and you actually show them women who have been successful in this area, they're more receptive to this. And, when they realize that there's even money to be made, it becomes even sweeter, and it becomes a sweeter deal. So yes, behavior change is very important, but that inclusion, in African culture, our men in the past mainly were more of like, we're the head of the home, we say everything. But when you bring women to the table and they're discussing these issues openly and they're making decisions, they're bringing change, and it's very receptive. And actually you find that once they're on board and, they're in the system, then everything, in fact, now men embrace it and they're willing to support them. And yeah. So I think it's just about educating the men and the community at large, because again, some women believe that they should not be at that table. So you need to let them know that they should be there. And, so that, and making the men feel safe and know that their position as the head of the home is still secure, but, the women bring economic empowerment, and I always believe that if you train a woman, you actually train a whole village. So it's beneficial to everybody.
Yes, 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 definitely. Just encourage if from the audience, if there's questions that are coming up for you, please go ahead and put them in the chat. We will have some time, and I'm seeing some of them and trying to incorporate them into the discussion, but just so let's keep that discussion going on in the chat. Bill, do you have anything else to add to this?
None for now. I'll be keen to hear from the audience if they have any questions, but as well as the valued input. I'm sure within the audience we have very many people that are well versed with the issues that we've been discussing. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you. So basically, what we've been talking about now is the asymmetries in the systems in terms of market information, data, how that's critical. The social inclusion is important, and the economic systems as well. I want to turn the discussion to something that that Loy brought up at the beginning, which is trade. And he said that Africa needs to be a producer. And so, COVID-19 is exacerbated a challenge that was already in place, that current food systems on the continent are dependent on a lot of international food trade. And of course, that was threatened through the pandemic. And when I talk about international, I think about cross-border. We work with a number of social enterprises, agricultural social enterprises on the continent, and we saw many of them struggle with the pandemic as the cross-border trade was shut down. And so I'm wondering, maybe Lloyd, you can kick us off, is like, how should we think about giving greater focus on building local decentralized food systems versus the international trade? And where's the balance between, again, these local decentralized systems versus the international larger systems?
Thanks, Pamela. And I think it's a really important question, not only within the country, but also to the neighbors. And increasingly, like we've seen in Rwanda, the majority of trade is actually to neighbors rather than globally, although that's increasing and rapidly. But it's important that when we think about these things, and one of the challenges that faced is that each national government is doing things to support obviously to support their nation, but sometimes the national governments are not coordinating among themselves, and this is why it's important to have the African Continental Free Trade Area and others, and I know Bill and them are working on some of these aspects, so that deficiencies in one country can be met by production or excess in others, and coordinating that. And we talk a lot about post-harvest losses in Africa as well, and a lot of that can be taken care of again by entrepreneurs who quickly can address that. Hey, if you have excess beans or fresh produce, that can be converted into tinned produce or dehydrated produce or frozen produce, and then moved, from there to other countries, or even kept in reserve and moved, into the city markets. In some countries, we're working also, for example, with fresh produce value chains, where we're connecting rural markets or rural aggregation points, and then connecting it to central terminal markets in the city, where these wholesale markets can then, provide access to restaurants, hotels, processors, downstream value adders, and eventually to exporters as well. So these are really important aspects. And again, information can drive a lot of that system and really identify. If you have accurate information, you can identify where those investment gaps are, where those distribution gaps are, and for example, cold chain investments, where do we put the cold chain when we need to? And that can be at the rural level, in the sort of village level hubs, or village level cold storage, or dehydration, or processing, or pack houses, for example, or it can be in the cities, and maybe there's a combination thereof. So just viewing it as a system not only at a subnational level, a national level, regional level, and continental level. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Lloyd. Actually, we're working with a social enterprise called Flamingo Foods, is using weather data and such to predict where there's going to be excess of food. In particular, they're focused on rice right now, where there'll be and where there's going to be deficiencies. And so being able to then predict so that then they can move food from areas of abundance to areas of scarcity, so that people can be fed and such. So that's really important. Bill, I mean, governments can play a key role here in deciding, how these continental free trade agreements go and such. I'm curious as to what you're seeing with that and where maybe some of the friction points are with being able to have, these cross-border situations just be a lot more free-flowing.
Thank you. Maybe if you allow Pamela first to supplement what Lloyd said, I think if there's anything that the pandemic has shown us is that with the disruption of movement of goods and services, national governments, regional governments will have to think more and plan better on how in the event that something like that happens, that there's always food for their populations. And that way, ensuring that they have enough storage, they have capability to produce. So, that brings me also to your question. One of the biggest disruptions is, of course, that once something like this happens, everybody thinks hoarding. You need to hoard. You need to keep everything to yourself, even more than you need. But because you're worried of the unknown, so the first thing you block your food exports because you want to ensure that your population has enough. So, and that really at times is based upon lack of even knowledge of how much produce that you have within the country. You can find that you may still be able to export and still feed your country. The Continental Free Trade Area is really a game changer for Africa, given that we all have different capabilities. We have different agroclimatic conditions, and the ag sector poses the best opportunity for Africa in terms of industrialization, because by adding value to our ag produce, we'll be able to solve the issues that we're talking about of post-harvest losses, where the issues that we're talking about of shelf life, moving food across borders with final products that can stay for long. We can then be able to move most of our food products across the continent. The key challenge that will be there will be, of course, the infrastructure, the movement across borders. Without a question, there will be some that will try to protect their markets. Within the negotiations, the food sector is one of the most sensitive areas in terms of the sensitive list. Some countries have ring-fenced that, and the reasons are understandable, as I said earlier. Other areas may be technical barriers to trade, non-tariff barriers, but I think our leaders are very committed to the growth of this one Africa market. And given the mobility of Africans across borders, this is an area that is going to grow without a question as we open up and collapse these borders that have created artificial boundaries between our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I can imagine, certainly as the hoarding piece and And certainly if there's one other piece that we've learned from the pandemic is you just really don't know what's going to happen and when things will get back to whatever normal means. And so I can imagine that being a challenge as Brenda was talking about, behavior change is needed on all levels of these discussions. And then infrastructure being a big challenge, and certainly road infrastructure, but telecommunication infrastructure. We keep talking about the role of data, and of course that means technology, and that means infrastructure investments that's needed in order to make this go. And so maybe Lloyd, you can talk a little bit about whether or not you see government leaders having the intention about investing in this infrastructure, and in order to make both the agricultural value chains, but other value chains go more smoothly.
Thanks, Pamela. Yeah, I think there's certain governments that really believe and see that this is an important part of the foundation. That ICT infrastructure, if you like, is almost as important as roads and energy and other parts. So I don't want to get into the politics of naming countries, but they're certainly across the continent, and we can certainly point anybody to those on an individual basis. But I would say that there's many countries that are really making progress in this area. But I would say that it really starts with some foundational aspects. One is land registry, and this is a really important aspect. And then the second really foundational aspect would be farmer registry, and that somehow relates also to national ID. And once you have those two things in place, the farmer registry or national identity plus the land registry, then on top of that you can then build all sorts of other tools on that foundation. And so this is what we're trying to engage with across the continent. We'd be very open to anybody who's in this space talking to us.
Great, thank you. So last, I wanted to talk a little bit about, it's already come up, but policy is an important aspect across all of these elements, right? And so we talked about, I think it was Brenda that brought up, inclusive policies is critical for women to have a seat at the table and for this to be an equitable system. We've talked about even some of the things that we were just talking right now about farmer registry, Lloyd, and those things. It feels like that those are policy related. So any other pieces that we haven't really covered from a policy point of view that is important to have as a part of this discussion, and that is getting attention again to build sustainable and scalable agricultural food value chains? Bill, I mean, from a governmental perspective, do you are there some other policies that you or in Rwanda are working on that hasn't been brought up in this discussion that you feel is an important aspect?
Collaboration, I think, is very, very critical. And collaboration really bringing in even other actors like academia, because there's quite a lot of knowledge that is out there that at times is not easily accessible. Equally, something that we've not touched, but is going to be very important going forward is how do you prepare bankable business cases to attract large investments within the ag sector? Because ultimately, to move our grower model into commercial business, to a large extent, either you can take the long route of organic growth or you can be able to attract large investments that can then support smallholders achieve economies of scale as a group. So deliberate actions that can be able to attract large investments within the ag sector. And this really not from a productive perspective alone. It can be from an input side, it can be from aggregation, it can be from mechanization, it can be logistics. For us to achieve large areas of scale, we need large players. And when you look at the players within our agriculture sector, to a large extent, they are very small. They are very small. So to be able to scale, to achieve our rush to attract technologies within the ag sector, if we have large players, they then can then be able to bring most of these technologies on board based upon their long experience, based upon their ability to mobilize and leverage these resources that they can be able to do given their size. So the deliberate efforts that are put in place to be able to attract some of these large investments, it's very critical in the ag sector.
Thank you. And Brenda, just curious if you have some other thoughts about other policy positions that need to be addressed, so we haven't addressed yet.
Thanks, Pamela. I think one of the major lessons I've learned working in the policy advocacy space, specifically in Kenya, is really for governments to understand that their sole mandate is to provide an enabling environment or create policies that allow private sector to drive business, so that government does not do the work of the private sector and really allows for private sector to create that environment to allow for technologies to be scaled up, for sustainable intensification of smallholder production systems, really to allow for technologies to really scale up. Because most of the time you'd see that governments double in business. They actually want to get involved in the business of the economy of agriculture, but really is to let private sector drive the system and let them enable the environment through creation of policies that are really, as I'd mentioned, very inclusive of the different stakeholders that are in play. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. And Lloyd, something to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm going to blatantly quote from the Malabo Montpellier panel, who 2 years ago published a great report called Bite by Bite, and I'll forward a link on the chat. And really talking mainly about the importance of digitalizing at the core of national agricultural growth and transformation strategies, and not something as an add-on. So I think this is a key thing. So making sure that digitalization is at the core of the national ag policy, and then creating this transparent and smart regulatory environment that promotes the development and confident use of digital technologies. And I think a really important point also that hasn't perhaps been mentioned, which is mentioned here, is the role of education, and really helping to transform not only farmers with adult basic education in terms of how to use basic digital tools, but also transforming universities and small business development opportunities to train on app development, on even SMS based development, and other sort of digital tools that can be used. So really sort of strengthening those skills, and then making sure that there's incentives, both in some cases national level incentives to use these digital systems, but also financial incentives, in other words, through the trading platforms or the other sales platforms or delivery of inputs, for example, utilizing that either e-vouchers or other types of tools that can be used to incentivize the use of digital agricultural tools. I'll forward the link also on this site.
Yeah, that'd be great, Lloyd. Thank you. So we're coming to an end now. So, I mean, we've had a wide-ranging discussion around how to balance the asymmetries in the ag value chain so that then we can build sustainable and scalable and race to scaling these food systems, because it is critical for the continent and the world at large. And so we talked about technology and data being a real key underpinning for all this, but then, talking about gender norms and the role of policy, and all of these pieces are critical, and that everyone needs to be at the table solving their pieces of the puzzle. Angela early on talked about public-private partnerships. Bill shared about the key role that governments can play, how entrepreneurs and funders and all of these players need to come to the table. So with just a couple minutes left, what I'd like to do is have all of you, and so there's a lot of work to be done and such, but I'm sure that all of you are feeling optimistic about something with respect to this discussion. And so if each of you can take like a minute to share what you're optimistic about, what you see as a bright shining light of hope in this discussion, that would be fantastic. And so maybe Angela, we can start with you.
Thank you, Pamela. Just like Lloyd said, that digitization is at the core of ag development. I totally agree with him. And our governments should focus on, policies that create an enabling environment for this to happen. And in addition to that, there should be dialogue with the stakeholders to make sure that these policies actually are helpful to them. My greatest hope at this point is that women are economically empowered and they're taking charge of their destiny. Thank you.
Love it. Love it. Brenda, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Pamela. I think what I'm really optimistic about is that the discussions around resilience and sustainability and scalability are becoming staple in the ag sector. So this is really creating a really good foundation for the decisions that we're going to make, be it policy, gender, technology. And just as a closing remark, really, we need to focus on integration and implementation. Integrate systems that are already in existence and implement the policies and the technologies that we have available, just to ensure that we are using that platform that we've created for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill.
Thank you, Pamela. I think if there is one thing that I can zero in, mobile phone penetration and broadband penetration that is reaching every corner on the continent. With time, most of the things that we're talking about, digitization, as it moves from laptops to the phone, most of our smallholder farmers are going to have access to information that otherwise has not been possible for a very long period of time. So I see that really going to be the key thing that is going to change the livelihoods of smallholder farmers and reduce the information asymmetry that we've been talking about that puts them at a disadvantage. So with time, we see that changing as it creates more of an even playing field, although it's not that even, but it kind of evens out some of the key challenges that have been existing. So I think mobile phone penetration is going to be a key thing that is going to change the ag sector going forward. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Bill. And Lloyd.
Thanks, Pamela, and thanks also for this great session. The challenge that we face really relates to the fact that 90% of farmers, even globally, don't have access to digital tools. And the ones that do there's a lot of data, but there's less knowledge, right? So converting data to knowledge is really something that also is really important. And also, what the last point on this point is also, it's really important to think about regenerative agriculture, making sure that the circular economy approaches are used, and really sort of building the green economy as we go out to 2030, 2050. But what gives me hope, I think, mostly is that, first of all, in Africa, we have enlightened leaders like Bill and like others, a new generation of leaders that are coming through and really can make a huge difference to the continent. We have fantastic youth that are really making a difference and are generating, not only at the farm level, but also in support of farmers, many individual small businesses and other innovation tools. I'd like to see them partnering more with not only creating their own solutions, but also partnering with global technology providers. So matching entrepreneurs on the continent with global technology providers. And then secondly, both companies and investors have become much more impact oriented and are really also delivering solutions. So both the private sector and also the sort of investment and finance arm really are driving a lot of change as well, where we see investments tied to deliverables in terms of impact. And I think that's really exciting as well. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks, Lloyd. And thank you all. So we've come to the end of our discussion, and it's been a very, very rich discussion. And the fact that all of you have hope is good, makes me feel good that we can make a difference in helping, race to scaling these sustainable food systems across the continent. So thank you, Brenda, Angela, Bill, and Lloyd for joining us. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for participating and sending your questions. Again, so I'm Pamela Roussos with Miller Center, and we actually are supporting a number of agricultural tech-enabled based social enterprises, and many of them are here at the conference, and you can stop by our virtual booth and learn more about the work that they're doing to address some of the challenges that we put forth here. But again, thank you all so much. Very much appreciate your time, and have a great day. Thank you.